And we'll welcome up to the stage our next speaker, Jerry Liu from Stanford University, coming from the field of computational math, advised by Professor Chris Ruh. Jerry completed his practicum at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in 2023, and Jerry's going to tell us about constructing efficient, fact-storing MLPs for language models. So Jerry, please take it away.
Amazing. OK, thanks so much for the introduction. Yeah, I'll be telling you guys about some recent work studying factual knowledge in language models. This is work with these amazing collaborators at Stanford and at Buffalo. OK, so just to give you an overview, I'll first give some background knowledge on why factual knowledge is an interesting thing to study in language models. I'll then motivate this kind of toyish problem about constructing MLPs, which are a type of neural network that explicitly store facts, and why this is actually kind of an interesting question that captures some interesting components of real language modeling. And then finally, I'll talk about this surprising capability that this unlocks, namely the ability to edit facts inside language models simply by swapping out certain submodules. OK. So I don't have to tell you guys, but language models have gotten surprisingly good in recent years. And one key reason for this is because they're able to very efficiently store a whole bunch of facts into their weights. There's this concept of neural scaling laws, which says that as you increase the number of parameters in these models, they just get better at verifiable tasks like math and coding. And folks have also studied this question in the context of knowledge storing. So a number of folks have kind of scaled up models and asked the question, how much information can they store as you increase the model size? And the surprising finding is that there's actually this consistent number of bits per parameter that these models tend to store, and that number is somewhere around 2 to 4 bits of information. And just for context, these models typically store their weights in kind of int 8 or even like int 4 type representations. So this is actually scarily efficient, and it's kind of not well understood how it's possible that these models can store this information so efficiently. For a bit more context on how language models work, they typically are these kind of transformer architectures. And so there's a bunch of layers of these transformer blocks. Each block contains these attention architectures and then also these MLP layers. And so you can think about kind of language models processing sentences by turning them into sequences of d-dimensional vectors, where each d-dimensional vector represents like some kind of word. And so all you really need to know is that attention basically mixes information along the sequence dimension. It says kind of how does this word relate to this other word. And MLPs, which stands for multi-layer perceptron, kind of mixes in the opposite direction. So it takes each token and kind of does some processing on it. And even though each layer kind of consists of one attention layer and one MLP layer, if you actually count the number of parameters, modern language models tend to dominate their parameters in the MLPs. And so the split in modern architectures is more like 80% of the parameters are actually these MLP layers. And so there's been a lot of work trying to understand how attention works and trying to improve that part of the architecture, much less work trying to understand how the MLPs actually work in language models. So one line of work that's actually pretty interesting and kind of motivates this work is kind of on the mechanistic interpretability side. So there's these papers that basically take sentences like the capital of Ireland is Dublin, and they try to do these like statistical correlational type studies. So they ask, take my pre-trained model, can I identify like neurons or activations that kind of most increase the probability that the model will answer like Dublin in these situations. And they say that, OK, these neurons maybe correspond to this like factual knowledge. And so there's a long line of work, I'm showing a result on the right, that kind of tries to study how fact storage works in pre-trained models. However, this line of work isn't quite precise enough to study some of the basic questions that I was motivating before. For example, if you just give me an MLP, like how exactly does it actually store facts? Like it's very unclear what the precise mechanism is. Moreover, this kind of surprising statement that different language models actually store facts at a very consistent rate. Like, can we say something theoretically about what that rate should be? And finally, can we say something about how robust is the fact storing or retrieving capability, both for MLPs and also when they're stored inside transformers? And so to answer these questions, we kind of propose an alternative way of studying the system. Instead of taking pre-trained models and kind of trying to understand how they work, we actually kind of go bottom up. And so we defined this synthetic fact storage task. And we asked the kind of theoretical question, if you give me a general fact set, which I'm just going to think about as a map from d-dimensional keys to d-dimensional values, can I kind of write down a set of neural network weights that actually captures this mapping? And so you can think about these keys as capturing like this book-author relationship in this example. OK, and the headline results will be, I'll show you that actually there's a very simple closed-form construction for performing this task. That construction is information theoretically optimal in the number of facts per parameter it can store, both standalone and when you insert these modules into transformers. Empirically, when you implement them, there's actually kind of only a 6 to 10x facts per parameter gap to models that you just kind of train from scratch. And for context, this is about 10 to 100x better than prior work. And finally, I'll tell you a little bit more about this modular fact editing capability. OK, before I tell you about the construction, let me describe the MLP architecture a little bit more. You might be familiar with this from your kind of classical ML class. Very similar architecture is still used in language models. MLPs are just kind of a map from d dimensions to d dimensions. And the way they do this is there's this upsampling step that basically sends your vectors from d dimensions to a higher m-dimensional space, and then downsamples back down. And so the number of parameters in this operation is O of m times d. OK. One more thing we'll need to describe is what we actually mean by fact storage. And here we actually have to think a little bit about how language models work. And so there's kind of this operation in language models where you're kind of operating in continuous valued space with all these weird vectors. And then at some point, you actually have to convert back to language. And so there's this kind of like rounding step. And so when we talk about fact storage, we're going to be talking about this vector-vector mapping. And our goal is to learn an MLP where you pass in key 1, and you want to output something close to v1. But we're actually going to allow this kind of margin of error, where the MLP doesn't exactly have to output the right vector. It just needs to be kind of close enough. And more specifically, it needs to be closer to the correct value than any other value. And by defining our problem this way, we're also giving our MLP this margin of error that it can have. So for example, if you have noisy outputs or noisy inputs, there's actually a little bit of error tolerance built into the system. And I'll describe later that this is super important for transformers. OK, so the construction is actually pretty straightforward. All we do, if you remember our setup of keys mapping to values, all we need to do is just take a bunch of outer products. So in red here, we have our value vector. And then in blue, we have our transposed key vector. And then by taking the outer product, we have this like rank 1 matrix in purple. And our construction is literally, we will form this B matrix by just summing up all of these outer products for all of the facts. So if you're familiar with Hebbian memories or associative memories from kind of neuro-inspired AI from the 80s, this is a very well-studied, classically known object. Our little twist here is that we introduced this phi. And this is kind of a feature map that actually corresponds to that upper m-dimensional projection inside MLPs. And actually, in this construction, this is kind of the whole game. So for our specific construction, there's kind of just 2 tricks you need to know in kind of what is the right kernel that we want to choose. The first point is that we want to use, we want to use a quadratic kernel, which is we want to measure the similarity between k and q as basically this dot product squared. And the intuition for why we want to do this is we basically want to make similar vectors more similar and dissimilar vectors more dissimilar. So if you imagine like 2 vectors that are already dot product is like very close to 1, squaring it still keeps it around 1. On the other hand, if you have 2 pretty dissimilar vectors where the dot product is like rho, which is significantly less than 1, then squaring it actually sends it even further away from 1. And so basically, by applying this kernel, we're kind of making the clustering stronger and stronger, and we're actually able to better disambiguate between kind of similar or kind of dissimilar vectors. The other trick is that we can actually get away with this kind of continuous notion of how well are we disambiguating these vectors by using this parameter m. And concretely, m uses this like randomized sketch to approximate the quadratic kernel. All you really need to know here is that if you decrease m, you're getting away with fewer parameters. But also, you're having like a larger approximation to the quadratic kernel, and so you occur some more error. And with this setup, we are now equipped to kind of understand all that's happening inside these MLPs. If you think about taking an MLP and passing in a given key into the MLP, think again about that sum of outer products. You're going to basically have this signal term, which is like the correct key. So you'll have the correct value multiplied by the similarity in kernel space between ki and itself. And if you remember, by construction, this thing's basically 1. So like this signal term is like the correct answer. But because we're jamming a bunch of facts together into a single matrix, you also have these like off-target effects, these distractors. And so you'll have a sum of all of the other possible facts weighted by like how similar the kernel thinks these different keys are. And so this is kind of the whole game of MLPs and of this construction. So if you think about having a fixed-size MLP and trying to jam more facts into it, basically that means you're adding more distractors into this term, and so you're going to be able to store fewer facts. If you increase the feature dimension, you're basically increasing the capability of this kernel function, and so you're better able to disambiguate between similar or dissimilar features. And then you can also show that if you have weird geometries, for example, if keys are similar, like correlated, for example, then this factors in as like additional constants in these terms. OK, let's now talk about capacity. So we'll start by thinking about what is a lower bound for any possible neural network to represent these types of feature maps. So let's just think about generally we have f facts, we have f keys, and f values. How many bits of information do we need to capture this, this idea? Well, there are f to the f possible mappings, because each key could map to any of the possible f values. And so taking the logarithm of this means we have f log f bits worth of information in any given fact mapping. And so that means any neural network with a constant number of bits per parameter needs this many parameters to actually be able to store this information. What's exciting about our construction is that we actually perfectly capture this scaling. So our construction needs exactly number of parameters equal to f log f. And on the right, I'm showing you a plot of the empirical results when we actually implement this construction. So on the x-axis, we have the number of parameters. So we freeze the neural network size, and then we binary search over the number of facts to see what is the maximum number of facts that this MLP can store. And as an aside, I'll note this is where HPC and Perlmutter have been incredibly useful, because each of these binary search steps requires training a full new model from scratch. So you can imagine how much compute this takes. So the important lines here on the far right, this is the previous best construction in yellow. And then on the left in red, this is the trained from scratch neural networks. And you can see there's a huge gap in efficiency between the previous best results. And our best construction in purple significantly closes the gap, 10 to 100x more efficient. OK, talking briefly about how attention adds to the picture when we're talking about adding these guys into transformers. If you think about a query like the author of 1984 is, attention's job is basically to like extract this key from the sentence and like put it into the MLP. And roughly what you can imagine this attention is doing is it'll like get the right answer, but then sometimes it'll like add a little bit of noise because it needs to process like all of the other words in the sequence. And so what that means is basically it'll just give the correct answer to the MLP modulo like a little bit of input noise. And so the MLP needs to be a little bit more fault tolerant than it otherwise would be. But theoretically, we can show if you have a constant amount of noise, the MLP again achieves the same asymptotically optimal storage capacity rates. And so on the right here, I have the same type of plots. And you can see the gap between prior work and trained models is even larger in this transformer setting. And ours significantly closes the gap. So we're within like 3x of real models. OK, finally, let me just quickly discuss fact editing. So this is kind of a crazy ideal that we would love to have. Suppose we have a pre-trained model that memorizes a whole bunch of facts about books and their authors. And then suppose we want to change one of the facts. So now we want to change the author of 1984 to Agatha Christie. So kind of naively, you would have to just retrain the full model from scratch if this were the case. But is there a way we can kind of efficiently edit facts just by changing submodules, by like localizing the information? And we have kind of some signs of life that this is actually possible. So this is just kind of a pretty toy one-layer setting. This is, again, just your standard transformer block. The only extra detail is that we have the MLP is now split into two components. So we have this Hebbian construction that we've just been talking about. This is supposed to store all of the factual knowledge. And then here we have this extra expert, which is supposed to capture all other language modeling capabilities. And so the idea is, if we want to edit a fact, we're just going to swap our construction out for a new construction that stores different facts. And the hope is that this model will actually work. And we show that it actually does. So on this kind of toy task, we show that our model gets basically 100% edit success with very few off-target effects. And compared to other fact editing methods, they do okay until you kind of significantly edit a large number of facts, and then their performance kind of falls off. So to summarize, I've hopefully convinced you that by studying this toy task, we're actually saying some pretty interesting things about language models. We're able to capture this optimal capacity storage that we observe in real LLMs. Empirically, our construction has this parameter efficiency that's very similar qualitatively to real LLM scaling. And we've shown you this kind of surprising modular editing capability. I'm really excited to continue working on this and exploring if we can now take pre-trained LLMs and kind of edit them a little bit to also allow this modular editing capability. OK, that's all I have. I'd like to thank my collaborators at Stanford and Buffalo, especially my advisors, Chris and Autry, my practicum advisors at LBNL, Ben and Michael, and former collaborators at LNL, Jin and Kenny, as well as, of course, DOE CSGF staff and my cohorts. You guys have made an incredible community, and my work really wouldn't have been possible without you. Thanks so much.